This is the Aggregate Model AP Economics Review. So this is the most important graph in AP Macroeconomics because instead of looking at individual markets like supply and demand, it looks at the entire United States, which is the whole point of AP Macroeconomics. So we're going to really break down this graph because this is the one you will most likely have to draw on the AP exam. So before we had prices on the Y, now we have price level, which is the same exact idea as inflation. So whenever it asks what happens to inflation in an economy, you're going to look right here on this specific graph to determine it. They go hand in hand together. If price levels are going up, then inflation is going up as well. Also, this is the graph that you use to analyze real wealth and real wages, and it goes inversely with whatever happens to inflation. So if price levels are going up, real wealth and real wages are going down. Because that just means when there's inflation, your money buys less. So you don't feel as wealthy and it doesn't feel like your income is buying as much. On the X, we have GDP. Now, this is output in economy, but also, although it doesn't say, you have to know that whatever happens to GDP, unemployment does the opposite. In this graph, you have to know that although it only explicitly says what happens to GDP, you need to know that unemployment will always do the inverse. So we have two short-run equilibrium lines, aggregate demand and short-run aggregate supply. These are also different from the supply and demand model. Aggregate demand isn't exclusively the consumers, and tripe does not fit into aggregate demand. Instead, what moves aggregate demand are the four components of GDP, C, I, G, and XN. If any of those four components of GDP move or are affected by anything, aggregate demand will move, which means all fiscal policy, because fiscal policy is aimed at changing the C and G of GDP, moves aggregate demand, and all monetary policy, which is aimed at changing the I of GDP, moves aggregate demand. These are known as demand-side policies because they're policies that affect aggregate demand. Short-run aggregate supply is only moved by two things. Resource cost, which is the R of gross. So all six things that move resource costs and supply also move short-run aggregate supply. Wars, wages, natural disasters, oil, steel, and lumber. Oil, steel, and lumber will be the ones you most often see on the short-run aggregate supply. And the second thing that moves short-run aggregate supply is productivity. By productivity, I'm talking about technology and education, which leads to an important distinction. I said that the I of GDP, gross private investment, which includes inventory, buying a new home, and physical capital moves aggregate demand, but human capital, education, moves short-run aggregate supply. So be very careful in the type of capital in determining which line you should move. Which also leads to an important point that there are two different things that could lead to long-run economic growth on this graph. Investment from GDP directly correlates with long-run economic growth. So if the I of GDP goes up and aggregate demand goes up because of that, it can also lead to long-run economic growth. And also productivity, which technology and education both under that umbrella, also both lead to long-run economic growth. Keep that in mind because they do move two different lines. The long-run line is specifically used to show how the economy is doing. This line is the same exact idea as the PPC, the Production Possibilities Curve from Unit 1. And on the Production Possibilities Curve, we showed that a point inside the line was a recession, on the line was full employment, and a point outside the line was inflation. That's exactly what we're going to use the LRAS for. And also because of that, we label the LRAS as the full employment quantity, which you may see College Board have you label that as QF or YF, and that label ends up going wherever the long-run equilibrium line goes. So if I wanted to show an economy starting in a recession or inflation, I would use the long-run aggregate supply to show that. So right here, I have an economy starting in inflation. So by starting the LRAS to the left of the short-run equilibrium, it shows that where I'm at my short-run equilibrium is above where I should be. So it's an inflated short-run equilibrium. So with that, as I said, the QF label, the quantity of full employment, goes with the long run line, and they may have you label the short run equilibrium as, let's say, PL1 and Y1 for short run GDP equilibrium and short run price level equilibrium. Then if I wanted to show the economy starting in a recession, I would start it with the LRAS to the right of the short run equilibrium. So now right here where we're at in our short run equilibrium is below where we want to be, hence the recession. I like to remember it as, in a recession, start the LRAS to the right. R, they go together. So with that, you don't shift the LRAS. You notice on both of these, I don't have two LRAS lines. Instead, I just start it to the left or to the right to start the economy in a recession or inflation. So on the graph, you very, very rarely, pretty much never, have two LRAS lines. You're just going to use it like the PPC to show how the economy is doing. The other thing with the aggregate model is that they used to draw the SRAS like this. They used to say the SRAS had three ranges, so this is called the traditional SRAS. And you will not have to draw these ranges on the AP exam, on the FRQ, but sometimes in the multiple choice they ask about, for example, the horizontal portion of the short run aggregate supply, or the upward sloping portion, or the vertical portion. So we're going to quickly go over what these three ranges are saying. So economists used to believe you could operate on the horizontal portion of the SRAS. And what I mean by that is when aggregate demand changes, we'll say increases, GDP increases, but price levels stay the same. This is one of the reasons we don't use this graph anymore. It's the idea that you can have growth without inflation, which contradicts the whole idea of demand pull inflation. With more consumption comes growth. However, if it ever asks about the horizontal portion, you have GDP going up and down with aggregate demand, but price level staying constant. I also like to call this the happy portion, because it used to be the government thought they could exist on this portion and grow the economy with inflation, so it's kind of idealistic. The upward sloping portion is just the normal short run aggregate supply line we have been drawing this entire semester. So it's upward sloping like every supply line to show that as price levels increase, GDP increases as well, which is demand pull inflation, just normal growth with inflation. So I give this one a neutral face. Then the vertical portion shows the worst case scenario, where if aggregate demand were to increase on the vertical portion, now we see that GDP isn't changing, however, price levels are going up by a lot. So I like to call this the sad face portion of this. So you used to be able to exist on one of these three portions in theory, but it was decided that the upward sloping portion is the one that exists in a realistic economy. The last thing I want to talk about goes with that idea with the three ranges of the short run aggregate supply, the vertical portion specifically. And it leads to one of the most complicated things with the aggregate model. The classical school of economics believes we don't need the government to interfere in the economy because it will naturally always return to this state of equilibrium. Even if it's in a recession or inflation in the short run, it'll come back to this without any interference from the government or the Fed. And they believe this by saying that in a recession or inflation, the short run aggregate supply will bring it back to long run equilibrium. Let's look at how that works. So if, let's say, we were at long run equilibrium and the government expands the economy, increasing aggregate demand, what we notice at our new short run equilibrium is that we are not in long run equilibrium anymore. We are in inflation, which is bad for society. But classical economists say it will not be permanent. Classical economists believe that in inflation, consumers will demand higher wages. So because the economy is inflating, we will demand higher wages. Which when you use that to think back of the things that move the graph, wages were a resource cost for the producer, which moves short run aggregate supply. So if wages increase, the resource cost for the producer increases as well. Which when you think about how that'll affect the graph, Resource costs going up means short-run aggregate supply ends up decreasing. Which, to illustrate that, short-run aggregate supply will move back to long-run equilibrium to the left right here. So then if we compare our original equilibrium to our new equilibrium, because we were inflated and it was created by the government, what ends up happening is our new long-run equilibrium is at a much, much higher price level, but without any real growth. So that illustrates that vertical portion of the traditional SRAS where we have inflation without growth. And is an excellent example of a criticism of the government that by creating that inflationary gap, it ends up leading to stagflation and then price levels being much higher than they were before. Let's do this one other way just to show both scenarios, because this does tend to be the trickiest thing with this graph. Let's do a scenario for no government interference, but the economy was starting out in a recession or inflation. And we'll specifically say a recession. The same concept still applies, that the government, if they don't interfere, this economy will still naturally fix itself, but in the opposite way. In the way that in a recession, because price levels are typically lower, people are willing to accept lower wages. So now, in a recession, because we're willing to accept lower wages, resource costs for the producers fall, which will do the opposite and shift the SRAS back to equilibrium by moving it to the right over time. So now, because we're willing to accept lower wages in a recession, SRAS will move to the right, back to long-run equilibrium over time. So in summary, classical economists believe that we don't need the government to interfere in the economy because it'll naturally fix itself through the short-run aggregate supply. And that's because in a recession or inflation, it affects how much we are paid in wages, which is a resource cost to the firm, which moves the supply line. And that is the end of the aggregate model review.